First story, Trucker on the Interstate, 1985. I never really believed in stuff like this. Honestly, I always thought UFO and alien abduction stories were just crazy talk. But what happened to me on a night in 1985 changed everything. I was driving down Interstate 287 somewhere in Texas, just a regular night in the middle of summer. The road was empty, the only sound being my truck's engine and the headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. It was peaceful, almost soothing, until something caught my eye. It started as a tiny dot in the sky, but it grew quickly, moving towards me. At first I thought it was just another vehicle, maybe a truck or a car coming up behind me. But the closer it got, the weirder it felt. The light wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It was this strange mix of green and blue, almost glowing like nothing natural. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to shake it off, thinking it could be some kind of reflection or something, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. I kept glancing in my mirrors, but there was nothing behind me. And then, there they were. Bright lights, hovering just behind my truck, matching my speed. I floored the gas pedal trying to outrun them, but the lights didn't budge. No matter how fast I went, they stayed right there, like they were sinking with every move I made. I'm not sure how much time passed, but I started to feel this weird heaviness in my chest. The road ahead seemed to blur. The lights were becoming too bright to ignore, almost like they were pulling me in. I felt dizzy, my vision getting shaky. It wasn't just the truck anymore. Everything around me seemed to distort. The air felt thick and pressurized. And then, just like that, it all went black. 1 second I was trying to outrun those lights, and the next I was out cold. The next thing I remember, I was waking up, but everything felt wrong. The truck was still moving, but I didn't remember hitting the gas. My body felt stiff, like I'd been asleep for hours, even though I knew it hadn't been long. I looked at the dashboard, and my heart sank. My watch was completely off. It was showing a different time, hours behind. I checked the clock again, thinking maybe I was just disoriented. But no, the time didn't add up. I had no memory of what happened in those lost hours. When I finally pulled over to the side of the road to take a break, I stepped out of the truck to stretch. That's when I saw it. On my arms and neck there were these strange red marks. They didn't hurt, but they were clear as day, like someone had pressed something into my skin. They weren't there before. My heart was racing as I touched them, trying to make sense of it all. I could have sworn I wasn't imagining any of it. And then, the strangest thing, I noticed something even weirder. My truck had been running fine before I passed out, but now it felt different. Like the engine was purring smoother than before, almost too smooth, as if it had been tampered with. I wasn't sure what to think anymore. It wasn't just the lights or the marks on my skin. Something felt off, like I had missed something huge. I didn't know whether I should be scared or if I should just get back in the truck and keep going. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to me that night was far from over. I kept driving, though I wasn't sure if I was just trying to outrun my fear or if I was truly trying to get back to some sense of normalcy. The road was long, and my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every few minutes I would glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those damn lights again. But the sky behind me was empty, no trace of what had happened. My heart would skip a beat every time I looked, though. I kept telling myself I was just spooked, that it was some kind of freaky coincidence. But that didn't explain the marks on my skin or the way the time seemed to vanish. I kept trying to remember the lost hours, to piece together what had happened, but it was like a wall had been put up in my brain. I could feel something there, but it wouldn't come. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. My eyes felt heavy, and my mind kept playing tricks on me. Every shadow on the road seemed like something moving. Every odd sound felt like a warning. It wasn't just paranoia. Something had happened to me, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. As the night wore on, I found myself slowing down, my eyes growing heavier and heavier. I pulled into a truck stop around 3 a.m., hoping a cup of coffee would clear my head. But when I got out of the truck, I noticed something that froze me in place. The air smelled different, thicker somehow, like it was heavier with static. The lights in the truck stop flickered briefly, like a power surge. I shrugged it off, just thinking I was overworked. But then I saw a man standing near the diner's entrance, staring at me. He didn't move, didn't even blink, just stood there in the shadows, watching. The moment our eyes locked, my stomach dropped. There was something off about him. He looked normal, but there was this strange stillness about him, like he wasn't quite right. I thought about saying something, but I felt this gut instinct telling me to keep moving, to not get any closer. I quickly made my way to the diner, my feet almost dragging as I walked. I didn't want to take my eyes off the man, but I knew I had to. The last thing I wanted was to find out what he was really staring at. When I sat down at the counter, I tried to calm myself with the hot coffee in front of me, but the silence in the diner made my nerves worse. There were only a few truckers scattered around, but no one was talking, just eating, looking down at their plates. I tried to strike up a conversation with the waitress, but even she seemed distant, like her mind wasn't really in the room. I noticed that none of the truckers were paying attention to me, but at the same time, they weren't really paying attention to each other either. It was like everyone was in their own world, lost in their own thoughts. I don't know why, but I suddenly felt like I didn't belong, like I was being watched, but not by the people in the diner, by something else. That same strange feeling that had gripped me earlier that night was back, stronger than ever. The marks on my body started to itch again, and my wrist began to throb. The watch. I couldn't stop staring at it. The time was still wrong, hours behind, and no matter how much I adjusted it, it wouldn't budge. Then I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a reflection in the window just outside, a shape, a dark figure moving in the shadows. I turned quickly, but the figure was gone. There was nothing there. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but deep down I knew it wasn't my mind playing tricks. Something was following me, something I couldn't explain. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It felt like the air itself had thickened, like the world around me had shifted into something unfamiliar. The waitress brought me my coffee, but her eyes were distant, almost glazed over. She didn't speak much, just handed me the cup with a forced smile before walking back to the kitchen. The other truckers didn't say a word either. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, louder than it should have been. Every time I looked out the window, I felt a strange pull, like there was something out there waiting for me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the cup in front of me, but my hands were shaking. I never used to be this jumpy. I never used to be afraid of things I couldn't see. But after that night, everything felt different. The truck stop was too quiet, too still. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And I had this sickening feeling that I was the one they were waiting for. I decided to leave, pay my tab, and get back on the road. The sooner I got back to driving, the sooner I'd feel like myself again, or so I hoped. When I got back into my truck, I noticed something I hadn't before. The dashboard lights were dimmer than usual, almost as if the power was lower than it should be. I reached to adjust the dimmer switch, but it wasn't working. My heart sank. It wasn't just the lights. Everything about the truck felt different. The steering wheel was too smooth, like someone had oiled it, and the gears shifted unnaturally, easily. It was as if the truck had been completely reset, like it had been altered in some way I couldn't understand. I checked my rearview mirror again. Still nothing behind me. No lights, no shadows. But that sense of being watched didn't go away. I felt it creeping up my spine as I pulled back onto the road, trying to shake the unease that had settled into my bones. The sky above was clear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. The darkness felt deeper than usual. The miles passed slowly, like the road was dragging me along, pulling me further into whatever strange place I had entered. And then, without warning, the truck's engine sputtered, and the lights on the dashboard flickered again. I pulled over, heart racing, not knowing if I was imagining things or if something was actually wrong with the truck. It had never done this before, not in all the years I'd been driving it. The engine made this weird hollow noise, like something wasn't quite right inside. I turned the key, trying to start it again, but nothing happened. The truck just sat there silent, like it had given up. I got out to check under the hood, hoping it was something simple, but when I lifted it, I froze. There was no engine, at least not the engine I remembered. It was like the whole compartment had been replaced with something strange. It looked almost like a different machine entirely, like something you'd see in a sci-fi movie. There were wires and tubes everywhere, some of them glowing faintly in the dark, like they were alive. I stepped back, my heart pounding. This couldn't be real. There was no way this could be happening. But as I stood there, staring at the mess under the hood, I realized I wasn't alone. The sound of footsteps came from behind me, slow and deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking towards me. I spun around, my stomach dropping when I saw the figure standing there. It wasn't a person, not really. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed almost too long, like they weren't quite human. The light from the truck's headlights barely touched it, but I could still see its silhouette standing perfectly, still, just watching me. My mind raced. Who was this? What did they want? But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was frozen, my body betraying me as the figure slowly took a step forward. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Its face, or rather, the lack of one. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth gray surface where a face should be. It was like the thing was wearing a mask, only the mask was its skin. I couldn't look away, couldn't tear my eyes off of it. I wanted to run, to get back in the truck, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I felt trapped, like something was holding me in place, forcing me to face whatever it was in front of me. The air around me was thick, buzzing with static, and the silence was deafening. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I don't know how long we stood there, but it felt like hours. The figure didn't move, didn't say a word. It just stood there, staring at me with that blank face. I could feel my skin crawling, my breath coming in short gasps. Then, without any warning, it took another step toward me, and I swear to God, I felt a jolt of energy rush through me, like a shock. My body suddenly felt light, like I was floating, and before I knew it, I was lying on the ground, staring up at the sky. But the sky wasn't right. The stars were swirling, shifting, as if they were moving too fast to be real. My head was spinning, and my vision blurred. I tried to sit up, but it was like my body didn't belong to me anymore. My limbs felt heavy, like I was made of lead. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. I wanted to call for help, but the words wouldn't come. It felt like I was in some kind of dream, but it wasn't a dream. It was real. Every part of me knew this was happening. I could hear a faint hum in the air, a low, vibrating sound that made the hairs on my neck stand up. And then everything went dark again. When I woke up, I wasn't on the ground anymore. I was back in the truck, but it didn't feel like my truck. The seat beneath me was softer, the air inside cooler. I looked at the dashboard, but it was completely different. The gauges were all off, showing numbers I didn't recognize. I checked my watch again, and the time had changed again. This time, it was showing hours ahead, way ahead. My heart started racing, and I could feel sweat starting to form on my forehead. I couldn't remember how I got back in the truck. I couldn't remember anything that had happened in the last few hours. It was like someone had just hit the reset button on my entire experience. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings, but all I could see were the same dark roads stretching out in front of me. There were no signs, no lights, nothing that told me where I was. I didn't know if I was still in Texas or if I was somewhere else entirely. I just knew one thing. Whatever had happened to me, it wasn't over. I could feel it. It was like something had changed inside me, like I wasn't the same person anymore, and I didn't know if I'd ever be the same again. I kept driving, though I wasn't sure where I was going anymore. The road stretched out in front of me, but it felt like I was trapped in some kind of loop. The same trees, the same patches of grass, the same empty sky. It was as if I had been pulled into another reality, one where nothing made sense. The hum in the air still lingered, a soft buzz that I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried to focus on the road ahead. The truck's headlights illuminated nothing but darkness, and it was like I was moving through a tunnel that had no end. I tried to shake the feeling of unease, but it wouldn't let go. Every turn felt wrong, like I was being guided down a path I couldn't understand. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight, my knuckles turned white. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like I wasn't in control of anything anymore. My mind kept drifting back to those moments. The strange figure, the glowing wires under the hood, the feeling of being watched. I couldn't escape it. I wanted to pull over, to get out of the truck, but I was too scared. I couldn't bring myself to stop. I felt like if I did, whatever was following me would catch up, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. Eventually, the truck began to slow down on its own, as if it were being controlled by something other than me. I tried to step on the gas, but it wouldn't respond. The engine sputtered and the lights flickered, dimming until they were barely visible. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to stop, but the truck had other ideas. It rolled to a halt, in the middle of the road, the engine letting out a final sigh before falling completely silent. I sat there for a long time, too afraid to get out, too afraid to do anything. The hum in the air was gone, but now there was another sound. Something low and guttural, like a growl coming from somewhere deep in the earth. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it made my skin crawl. Then, out of nowhere, a light appeared in the distance. At first I thought it was just another truck, but as it got closer I realized it was too bright, too strange. It moved erratically, like it was being tossed around by the wind. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't a truck. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. It was something else, something not from this world. And it was coming straight for me. The light moved closer, swirling and shifting in the air like a ball of fire. It was mesmerizing, but also terrifying. It seemed to get bigger and bigger the closer it came, until it was blinding, like I was staring at the sun itself. I couldn't look away, couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I could feel my body trembling, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The light grew so bright that I couldn't see anything else. Just this overwhelming, searing brightness that filled every inch of my vision. And then, Just as quickly as it had appeared, the light was gone. The world around me returned to normal, if you could call it normal. I was still sitting in the truck, still in the middle of nowhere, but everything felt different. The air was still thick like it had been before, but now there was an eerie silence. The hum was back, but it was faint, like a distant echo. I felt disoriented, as if I had just woken up from a dream, but I knew it wasn't a dream. It was real, all of it, and somehow I knew I would never be the same again. I don't know how much time passed after that. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. But when I looked at the dashboard, everything was back to normal. The truck was working fine. The time on my watch was correct. It was like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I knew something had changed. Something deep inside me. I just didn't know how to explain it. I don't know what happened that night, and I don't think I ever will. But I know I'll never forget it. The feeling of being watched, the strange figure, the light that came out of nowhere. It's all burned into my memory. I've tried to talk to people about it, but no one believes me. They say it was just a bad dream or that I was imagining things, but I know the truth. Whatever happened to me, it wasn't a coincidence. I can feel it in my bones. It changed me, and I'm not the only one who's had these experiences. I've heard stories from other truckers, other drivers who've seen strange things out there, on the roads. We all share the same fear, the same feeling of being followed, of being watched by something we can't explain. Maybe it's not over. Maybe it's just waiting, somewhere out there, for the next person to take the wrong turn, to get lost on the road. And I'll always wonder, what if I was just one of many? What if they're still out there, watching, waiting? Second story, The Alabama Farmer, 1957. It was a sweltering summer night in July 1957, the kind where the air feels heavy and every sound seems sharper in the stillness. I remember stepping out to check on the barn because the dogs wouldn't stop barking. They were going crazy, howling at something in the distance. At first, I thought it might have been a coyote prowling near the livestock. But as I got closer to the barn, everything went eerily silent. The crickets stopped chirping, and even the dogs froze, their ears pinned back. That's when I noticed it, a strange, bluish glow spilling out over the fields. It wasn't like the light from a lantern or even a car's headlights. This was something else, something I'd never seen before. My stomach knotted up, but kept walking, clutching the flashlight tight in one hand and a rusted crowbar in the other, just in case. When I stepped around the barn, I saw it. Hovering maybe 30 feet above the ground was this thing. It wasn't much bigger than my house, maybe 30 or 40 feet across, and it was shaped like an upside-down bowl with lights spinning along the bottom edge. It made this low humming sound, like a generator running far off in the distance, but it was constant, vibrating in my chest. My first thought was that it couldn't be real. I mean, who would believe it? But there it was, plain as day. I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the ground, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then I noticed movement below the ship. 3 figures stepped out of the shadows, walking in perfect unison, straight toward me. They weren't human. I'll say that much without hesitation. They were short, no taller than my chest, with pale gray skin that seemed to shimmer in the strange light. Their heads were too big for their bodies, and their eyes... God, their eyes. Black and almond-shaped, they looked right through me, like they could see every thought in my head. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond no matter how hard I tried. It was like they had some kind of hold on me. One of them raised a long, thin hand, and the next thing I knew, everything went black. There wasn't any pain or sensation, just this sudden, overwhelming darkness, like someone had flipped a switch in my brain. When I came to, I wasn't in the field anymore. I was lying on a cold metallic table, staring up at lights that were too bright, too white, to be from this world. As I laid there on that freezing table, I felt paralyzed, unable to move anything but my eyes. The room around me was sterile, almost clinical, and the walls seemed to shimmer with a faint metallic glow. Everything was silent, except for a faint humming sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. I could see figures moving around. Me, those same beings from the field. Up close, they were even more unsettling. Their skin wasn't just gray. It looked almost translucent in certain places, like you could see faint outlines of something beneath it, though I couldn't make out what. Their movements were smooth, almost mechanical, and they didn't speak, at least not out loud. But I swear I could feel something in my head, like whispers brushing against my thoughts. It wasn't words exactly, more like flashes of emotion or ideas, but they weren't mine. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I couldn't. My body refused to cooperate. That's when I noticed the tools. There was a tray beside me, filled with objects that looked like instruments, though nothing like what you'd see in a doctor's office. They were sleek, silver, and faintly glowing, with edges that seemed to shift and change shape when I looked at them too long. One of the beings picked up an instrument that resembled a long, thin rod and brought it close to my face. I couldn't move, but I could feel. The cold metal hovered just above my skin, and then I felt a strange vibration, not painful, but invasive, like it was reaching inside me without actually touching me. My vision started to blur, and I felt a strange warmth spreading through my chest, like they were doing something to my insides. I don't know how long it went on. Minutes, hours. Time didn't feel real in that place. My mind was spinning, trying to hold on to something, anything, but it was like they were prying into my thoughts, digging through my memories like they were flipping through the pages of a book. The strangest part was what I saw, or maybe what they made me see. As they worked on me, these vivid images started flashing in my mind. I saw places I'd never been before, vast landscapes with skies that weren't blue but a deep, glowing orange. I saw towering structures that defied any logic, twisting and curving in ways that shouldn't be possible. There were other beings too, ones that didn't look like the ones in the room with me. They were taller, more human-like, but their eyes glowed faintly, and they moved with the same unnerving precision. I don't know if it was real or if they were planting those images in my head, but it felt like they were trying to show me something, like they wanted me to understand something far beyond what I could comprehend. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The images, the vibrations, even the humming, it all went completely silent. One of the beings leaned in close, its enormous black eyes filling my vision, and for a moment, I swear I felt calm, like it was trying to reassure me. Then, everything went black again. When I woke up, I was back in the field, lying flat on my back in the dirt, staring up at the stars. At first, I thought it might have been a dream, some twisted nightmare brought on by the heat and exhaustion. But then I realized my body didn't feel right. My arms and legs ached, like I'd been stretched out for hours, and my chest burned, faintly, as if something had been pressed into it. I tried to sit up, but dizziness washed over me, forcing me to stay down for a moment longer. That's when I noticed the dogs again. They were barking from the house, but they wouldn't come near me. Normally they'd rush over if I so much as whistled, but this time they stayed rooted to the porch, growling low and nervous. Something about that hit me harder than anything else. Animals know when something's wrong, and at that moment, I knew too. I forced myself to my feet, my legs wobbling like I'd been drunk or drugged. The barn was just a few steps away, but it looked different somehow, smaller, darker. The glow was gone, and the hum had disappeared into the stillness of the night. Everything was back to normal, or at least it should have been, but it wasn't. I felt it in the air, in my skin, even in my thoughts. Something had changed. As I stumbled toward the house, I caught a glimpse of myself in the window reflection. My shirt was torn, and there was a strange mark on my chest, just below my collarbone. It was a perfect circle, about the size of a quarter, with tiny ridges along the edges that almost looked burned into my skin. I touched it, and though it didn't hurt, it sent a cold shiver down my spine. That was when the fear really started to settle in. This wasn't just some weird dream. This had happened. Inside the house, the clock on the wall read 3:17 a.m. The last time I'd checked it before heading out, it had been just past midnight. I couldn't account for those missing hours. What's worse, my body felt like I'd been through something far longer than 3 hours. I washed my face at the kitchen sink, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. That's when I saw it, the dirt on my hands. It wasn't just dirt from the field. It was mixed with a faint, glittering residue like a fine powder that shimmered faintly under the light. I scrubbed at it, but no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't come off completely. I kept staring at my hands, trying to make sense of it, but my mind was too scattered to focus. The harder I tried to remember every detail, the more it felt like the edges of my memory were fraying, like someone had plucked pieces out and left the rest in disarray. Something wasn't right, and deep down, I knew it never would be again. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, flashes of what happened, those lights, those creatures, that humming noise, came rushing back. My mind wouldn't stop replaying it, trying to piece it all together. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the mark on my chest through the torn fabric of my shirt. It wasn't red or inflamed, but it was there, a constant reminder that whatever happened to me wasn't some hallucination. I wanted to convince myself that I was overreacting, that there had to be some kind of logical explanation for all of it. But every time I looked out the window and saw the empty field, my stomach twisted into knots. That field wasn't just empty anymore. It felt wrong, almost sinister, like it was watching me. And the silence, it was the worst part. No crickets, no wind, not even a single dog bark. Just this deafening, unnatural stillness. Around 5 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and headed back outside, determined to make sense of it. I needed proof, something solid to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. As I walked toward the barn, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating, like I was pushing through something invisible. When I reached the spot where the ship had been, I froze. The ground wasn't right. The grass in that area was scorched, flattened into a perfect circle about 20 feet across. The edges of the circle were charred black, and when I knelt down to touch it, the soil crumbled between my fingers, dry and brittle like ash. I've lived on that land my whole life, and I've never seen anything like it. Whatever had been, there left its mark, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. That was when I noticed the metallic smell again, faint but unmistakable, like burnt wires mixed with something almost sweet. It made me gag, but I couldn't look away. Then I found something else, something that made my blood run cold. Lying just off the edge of the circle was a small, shiny object, partially buried in the dirt. It was smooth, about the size of a marble, and felt oddly warm to the touch despite the cool morning air. When I picked it up, I noticed tiny grooves etched into its surface, like symbols or patterns I couldn't recognize. The moment I held it, a strange sensation ran up my arm, like an electric pulse that left my fingers tingling. I wanted to drop it, but I couldn't bring myself to let go. It was like it was pulling me in, urging me to keep it. My head started pounding, and for a split second I thought I heard something. Voices, faint and distant like a radio playing in another room. I stuffed the object into my pocket and stumbled back toward the house, my heart racing. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't something I should have found. Something about it felt alive, almost as if it was watching me. Back inside the house, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, though I knew it wouldn't make a difference if they decided to come back. My hands were trembling as I pulled the object out of my pocket and set it on the table. It seemed to glow faintly under the dim kitchen light, the grooves in its surface catching the glow in a way that made it look almost like it was moving. I couldn't take my eyes off it, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get rid of it, to throw it as far away as I could. But something about it had a hold on me, like it was digging into my mind, planting thoughts that didn't feel like my own. I started to feel dizzy, the room spinning slightly as a sharp pain shot through my temple. Then, for a split second, everything went completely quiet, like the world had paused. And in that silence, I swear I heard a voice, faint but clear, say, "You're not ready." That voice, it wasn't human. It wasn't even something I could describe. It was deep, layered, like multiple voices speaking at once, echoing in my skull. The words didn't just feel like sound. They felt like they were being forced into my brain, etched into my thoughts. I stumbled back from the table, knocking over a chair in the process. But the object didn't move. It just sat there, glowing faintly, almost like it was mocking me. I grabbed a dish towel and wrapped it around the thing, shoving it into a drawer and slamming it shut. Out of sight, out of mind. At least that's what I told myself. But the pressure in my head didn't go away. It felt like it was still with me, even though I couldn't see it anymore. I paced around the kitchen, trying to shake the feeling. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those creatures again. Their faces, their eyes, and that ship hovering over my field like it owned the place. I started to wonder if I'd ever feel normal again. Just as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, the dogs started barking again, loud and frantic like they'd been earlier that night. My stomach dropped and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I rushed to the window, half expecting to see the ship hovering over the field again. But there was nothing. Just the empty barn and the circle of scorched grass. The dogs weren't barking at the field, though. They were looking toward the house, toward me. Their eyes were wide, their fur standing on end, and they wouldn't stop growling, even as I called out to them. It was like they didn't recognize me, or maybe they knew something I didn't. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. That was when I noticed the hum again, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deep inside the house. I froze, listening, my eyes darting to the drawer where I'd shoved the object. The sound was coming from there. My breathing grew shallow. As I crept toward the drawer, every fiber of my being screaming at me to stop. But I had to know. I had to see it again. With a shaking hand, I pulled the drawer open. The dish towel was glowing faintly, a soft light spilling out from the edges where I'd wrapped it around the object. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the light faded and the hum stopped. The object sat there, silent and cold, like nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew it wasn't over. I don't know how long I stared at it before I finally slammed the drawer shut and backed away, my chest heaving like I'd just run a marathon. That was the last time I touched it. I buried it later that day, deep in the woods behind the property, and haven't gone near it since. But sometimes when the nights are quiet and the stars are bright, I still hear that hum, faint and distant, like it's calling out to me. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever happened that night wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story, The Scientist in Antarctica, 2003. It happened during my second winter working at a remote research station in Antarctica, where the nights stretched for months, and the silence was so heavy it felt alive. The cold was brutal, the kind that sinks into your bones and makes you feel like your body will never be warm again. That night I was alone in the observation deck analyzing data from ice core samples. It was the middle of the night, or at least what we called night, since the sun hadn't risen in weeks. I remember the hum of the generators in the distance, a sound I'd grown used to, and the flickering light of my monitor as I worked. Then, all at once, the hum disappeared. Complete silence. I looked around, confused. Even in Antarctica, where isolation is constant, silence that absolute was unnatural. My heart started racing as I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the snow-covered expanse was illuminated by an eerie, bluish glow I couldn't identify. It wasn't the aurora. This was different. Concentrated, deliberate, and frighteningly close. At first, I thought it was some kind of strange weather phenomenon. I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the icy wind, drawn by curiosity and the nagging sense that this was something I needed to see. The cold bit at my face, but I barely noticed. My focus was on the source of that glow. When I rounded the corner of the station, I froze in my tracks. There, no more than 200 meters away, was what I can only describe as a spacecraft. It was massive, its surface smooth and metallic, reflecting the glow that surrounded it. The light didn't feel natural. It pulsed faintly, almost like it was alive. My legs felt like lead, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then I saw them. Figures, emerging from the craft. They were tall, at least 7 feet, and their movements were fluid but deliberate, as if gravity didn't affect them the same way it did us. They didn't look human, but they weren't entirely alien either. Their features were sharp, elongated, and their skin seemed to shimmer under the light. I should have run, screamed, anything, but I stood there, frozen in place. One of them turned toward me, and that's when I felt it. An overwhelming pressure in my mind, like a weight I couldn't shake off. I couldn't move, couldn't think clearly. It wasn't fear that paralyzed me, but something deeper, as though they were inside my head, calming me, convincing me to stay. The figure raised its arm. No, not an arm. Something more delicate, almost like tendrils of light. I felt a pull, not physical but mental, and before I knew it, I was walking toward them. My body didn't feel like my own, like I was being gently guided. The closer I got to the craft, the more I noticed details I hadn't been able to see from a distance. The surface of the ship wasn't smooth. It was covered in intricate patterns, almost like circuitry, glowing faintly with the same pulsing light. I didn't feel cold anymore, even though I should have been freezing. When I reached the base of the ship, one of the beings gestured toward a ramp that extended from the side of the craft. Against every instinct screaming in my mind, I stepped onto it and walked inside. The interior of the craft was nothing like I expected, if I even had expectations for something so incomprehensible. The first thing I noticed was the warmth. It wasn't just physical warmth. It was a sensation that seemed to wrap around me, soothing every nerve in my body. The walls of the chamber were unlike anything I'd ever seen, shimmering with patterns that shifted and flowed like liquid metal. There were no visible seams, no panels or wires, nothing that hinted at how the ship functioned. It was alive, or at least it felt that way. The air inside was thick, not stifling, but charged, like standing near a massive electrical field. The beings moved silently around me, their forms gliding effortlessly. One of them motioned for me to follow, and again, I felt that pull, not a force, but an invitation I couldn't resist. My legs carried me forward without hesitation, my mind calm but strangely detached, as though part of me was watching this unfold from a distance. They led me into a larger chamber, its ceiling stretching so high I couldn't see where it ended. The space was filled with orbs of light, floating and spinning in synchronized patterns. As I moved closer, I realized the orbs weren't just light. They contained images, moving scenes of places that couldn't possibly exist on Earth. One showed an ocean with waves of silver, reflecting a sky filled with multiple suns. Another displayed a city suspended in the clouds, its towers pulsing with the same strange light as the ship. My breath caught as I stared at these impossible worlds, each one more surreal than the last. The beings seemed to sense my fascination. One of them gestured toward a larger orb, which descended slowly in front of me. The surface rippled like water, and as I gazed into it, I felt a surge of emotion, wonder, fear, and something I couldn't quite describe, like a deep longing for something I didn't know I had lost. The orb's surface stabilized, and an image appeared, a planet, dark and foreboding, with storms swirling across its atmosphere. Unlike the others, this place felt wrong. The sight of it sent a chill through me, breaking the strange calm I'd been feeling until that point. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The storm on the planet seemed alive, twisting and surging as though it were aware of me. I felt a pressure in my chest, a growing dread that made it hard to breathe. The beings stood silently around me, their expressions, or what I assumed were their expressions, unreadable. Then, without warning, the image vanished, and the orb dissolved into the air. The overwhelming sensation of calm returned, as though they were intentionally erasing the fear they'd allowed me to feel. One of them stepped closer, placing a hand, or something like a hand, on my shoulder. The contact sent a wave of warmth through me, but it wasn't comforting. It felt like an unspoken command: remember, but do not question. Before I could process anything further, I felt a sudden shift in my surroundings. The air grew heavier, and a deep hum resonated through the chamber. The beings around me moved with a new urgency, their fluid grace now tinged with purpose. One of them gestured toward a nearby wall, which rippled and transformed into a passage leading deeper into the ship. My feet moved before my mind could protest, and I followed without question. The corridor stretched endlessly, the walls pulsing gently with that strange living light. I could feel it under my fingertips as I brushed the surface, and it sent a tingling sensation up my arm, like touching something that was almost, but not quite, alive. As we moved deeper, I started to see symbols on the walls, intricate and alien, but oddly familiar, as if they were meant to communicate something just beyond my comprehension. I felt a strange connection to them, a sense that they were meant for me, though I had no idea why. Eventually we entered another chamber, one vastly different from the first. It was darker, the glowing patterns subdued, and the atmosphere more intense. In the center stood a massive structure, an obelisk-like pillar that pulsed with a steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. The beings surrounded it in a semicircle, their focus entirely on the structure. I could feel something emanating from it, waves of thought, emotion, something I couldn't put into words but could sense deep inside me. As I stood there, transfixed, one of them stepped forward and placed a hand on the pillar. Instantly my mind was flooded with images, planets, galaxies, things beyond human understanding. It was overwhelming. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the floor. My vision blurred, and I could feel my consciousness slipping away, drowned in the vastness of what they were showing me. I remember gasping for air, clutching at the ground, desperate to hold on to something real. Just as quickly as it started, the connection was severed. The images disappeared, and the overwhelming pressure in my mind lifted. I found myself lying on the floor, trembling, but somehow different. I looked up at the beings, and for the first time I sensed something resembling emotion in their expressions. Not pity, but understanding. They had shown me something I wasn't supposed to see, something too vast, too incomprehensible for my mind to grasp fully. Slowly they helped me to my feet, their touch gentle but firm. I expected them to lead me further, to show me more, but instead, they guided me back the way we had come. My mind was still reeling, my body weak, but I followed obediently. The corridors blurred past me, and before I knew it, I was standing outside again, the icy wind biting at my skin. I turned back toward the ship, watching as the beings disappeared into its glowing interior. Then, without a sound, it lifted off the ground and vanished into the darkness of the Antarctic sky. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty space where the craft had been, my breath forming thick clouds in the freezing air. The glow that had bathed the snow moments ago was gone, leaving only the stark, unforgiving darkness of the Antarctic night. My legs felt weak, and I sank to my knees, the cold finally seeping back into my bones. I touched my face, half expecting to feel something different, but everything felt normal. And that was the strangest part. After everything I had just experienced, the world around me was exactly the same. The station was still there, the wind still howled, and the darkness stretched endlessly in every direction. For a moment, I questioned if any of it had been real. Had I hallucinated it all? The rational part of me wanted to believe it was just exhaustion, isolation, playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew. I felt it. Something had happened to me. Something I couldn't explain or understand. And worse, I had no idea what it meant. I eventually forced myself to stand and stumbled back inside the station, locking the door behind me as if that would somehow keep them out, if they wanted to return. My hands were shaking as I stripped off my gear and collapsed into the nearest chair. The control panel blinked back at me as if nothing had happened, and the familiar hum of the generators had returned. I reached for the radio, my fingers hovering over the call button. But who would I even call? What would I say? Hey, I think I was just taken inside an alien spacecraft. They'd think I'd lost my mind. Hell, I wasn't even sure I hadn't lost my mind. My heart pounded in my chest, and I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to focus on my breathing, in and out, slowly. I needed to ground myself, to push away the lingering sense of whatever that had been. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that I wasn't alone anymore, that they had left something behind inside me. Sleep didn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of those images, the planets, the obelisk, the swirling storms on that dark, foreboding world. They were burned into my mind, etched so deeply that I knew I'd never be free of them. I kept hearing that deep hum in my head, like an echo of something far away but still present, lurking in the background. I found myself pacing the small room, checking the windows every few minutes, half expecting to see that glow again. But it never came. When the first faint light of the Antarctic morning finally crept over the horizon, it brought no relief. I felt different, disconnected from everything around me, like a part of me was still on that ship. I looked at my reflection in the small mirror by my bunk, searching for any sign of change. My eyes stared back, the same color, the same face. but I could feel it deep inside me. Something was different, and I had no idea if I would ever be the same again. Over the next few days, I tried to return to my routine, to focus on my work and convince myself that everything was normal. But it wasn't. Every sound, every shadow outside the station made my skin crawl. I found myself obsessively checking the sky, searching for any sign of their return. I'd catch myself staring blankly at my equipment, the data meaningless in the face of what I'd experienced. The worst part was the dreams, if I could even call them that. Every time I managed to drift off, I'd find myself back on the ship, surrounded by that pulsing light, those towering figures watching me in silence. And then there was the voice. Not words exactly, but thoughts, alien and intrusive, whispering, things I couldn't understand but somehow felt were important. Each time I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, my pulse racing, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still connected to me, that no matter where I was, they could reach me whenever they wanted. I debated telling someone, my colleagues, my superiors, anyone, but every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. How could I explain something so impossible without sounding completely insane? So I kept it to myself, pushing through each day like a ghost, barely present. The isolation of Antarctica, something I had once found comforting, now felt suffocating. Every night I sat by the window staring out into the endless white, wondering if they would come back. And deep down, a part of me feared they already had, that whatever they had done to me wasn't over. I started noticing strange things, little inconsistencies I couldn't ignore. My sense of time felt off. Sometimes hours would slip by without me realizing. Objects in the station seemed to shift slightly, never where I remembered leaving them. And the worst part, the strange tingling sensation at the base of my skull, as if something was waiting, watching, growing. Then one evening, something happened that shattered any lingering doubt I had. I was sitting at my workstation staring at my notes when the lights flickered, and for a brief second, I heard that hum again. Not through the station systems, but inside my head. My vision blurred, and for a split second, I saw them. Not in a dream, not a memory, right there, standing in the room with me. It was only for an instant, but I knew they had never really left. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and when I blinked, they were gone. The station was quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, or maybe even closer than that. I don't know how much time passed before I realized I was clutching my chest, my heart pounding like it would burst. I wanted to scream, to run, but where could I go? There was nowhere to hide, not in a place like this, and then, nothing. The lights stabilized, the hum faded, and life went on as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I packed my things that night, cutting my assignment short, filing a report citing personal reasons. I left Antarctica on the next available transport, not even looking back as the ice stretched endlessly behind me. But even now, back in the so-called safety of civilization, I can't escape it. I see glimpses in my peripheral vision, hear faint whispers when everything is silent. Something changed that night, something they did to me. And no matter how far I run, I know they can still find me. They always can. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you have had a similar experience or have suggestions for future horror stories, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.